Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's interview show, where we talk about the latest issues affecting the transatlantic relationship today. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. And today we are talking all things France, and we have two excellent guests with us today that I'm so thrilled to announce. First of all, we have Tara Varma, who is a visiting fellow for foreign policy at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. She comes to us from ECFR, where she was the director of the Paris office, and she followed French foreign policy and European and Asian security developments there. We also have Miss Marie Jourdain, who's a visiting fellow at the Europe Center with me at the Atlantic Council. Before that, she worked for the French Ministry of Defense's Directorate General for International Relations and Strategy. There, she served at the North America desk, focusing on U.S. defense policy with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So, ladies, thank you so much for being with us today. We're thrilled that you could take time out of your schedule. So, Tara, I wanted to start with you. You are relatively new to D.C., just came to us from Paris. Can you give us an understanding of where the policy debate in Paris is right now with regards to Ukraine?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Rachel. And it's great to be on such a great panel with three amazing women, two amazing women and me, I should say. You're right. I have just arrived in DC literally a month ago. So I'm also looking at the European debate perspective and the French debate perspective from here, which is really enriching and helpful, I think, in a way to take a bit of geographical distance too. I would say the debate on Ukraine hasn't evolved so much. There is still a sense in Paris that European and transatlantic unity are absolutely paramount for us to move together and to ensure that, as the Franco-German communique that came out of the summit said, that there should be unwavering support to Ukraine. And I think it's important to reinstate that, because what we've seen in a way is an increasing debate on the European foreign policy side. We're looking, we've been discussing whether the center of gravity is shifting or not to the east, and I guess we'll get to that a bit later in the discussion. But I do think it's important to reinstate how Paris wants to be a leader in this discussion. Paris was presiding the Council of the EU presidency last year when the war broke out, and in that regard, this is a role which is mostly a moderating role in European institutions, but still, I think with the past efforts that Macron had made to reach out to Putin and everything he put at stake in a way to prevent the war, I think he felt very much that he still needed to lead on that discussion, preferably with the German ally and the German in the context of the Franco-German tandem. But he is still very much engaged in the discussion. I'm quite struck that in Paris, the war in Ukraine, it's been a year now, is very much still in the news headlines. Discussions about it are prominent. They're very present. The French public still very much supports all the efforts that have been put out. So I think it is very much present both in the government's mind, but also in the general public's mind.
Really interesting. Marie, I wanted to turn to you and sort of build off of Tara's comments. President Macron faced a lot of criticism early on in the war, which I think you can debate whether or not that's warranted, for speaking to Vladimir Putin and trying to find not just a negotiated settlement, but trying to play that role of being a mediator. Has that effort on his part changed? And I'd be curious as to your thoughts on how Paris sees not just Russia, but Vladimir Putin himself.
So I think, of course, there's been criticisms on Macron reaching out to Putin, especially at the beginning of the war. And I would say this has actually evolved, like the strategy of the dialogue evolved. At the start, the objective was to reach a ceasefire as soon as possible, to give Putin the messages President Zelensky wanted him to receive, because there was no direct contact. And also because we were saying Putin was very much isolated and not necessarily, receiving from his advisors a state of play, to show Europe and Western determination, in not letting that go, and making sure that Putin understands that he's doing a strategic mistake for his country. So there was a hope to change the course. And the idea was also that dialogue, could limit the risks of escalation. But despite that, escalation came from Russian part without, any decision that fuel it. And so always in the background, you had the objective of France, like you said, Rachel, to be considered as a mediator during and in the resolution of the conflict. And because at the end, the conflict is about Ukraine, what is Ukraine's future, but also about what will be Europe's future. And in that, France feels very critical to be at the table. At the same time, France clearly sided, as Tara said, with Ukraine, in supporting Ukraine. And so later on, with the multiplication of war crimes, the escalation from Russia, dialogue got more scarce, but also very much result driven. With last summer, for instance, the efforts to grant access for the International Atomic Energy Agency to Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And so now the dialogue only happens and you can have results, hopeful results. And on your last point on how Putin is seen, I think France made the distinction very clearly early on that there's a difference between Putin, who wants to restore an imperialist Russia with imperialist gains, and the people of Russia. And so France has been very aware that they need to continue to have a link with the civil society to support journalists, for instance, although it is very, very much complicated. And so in that regard, you may have a difference with some other European states, especially in Eastern Europe, making the link between Putin and the rest of Russia. And this is not necessarily the assumption right now in Paris.
Tara, coming back to you, one of the conversations that we've had on this show specifically is public opinion surrounding support for the war in Ukraine. We've talked to German experts about it, experts in Eastern Europe. It's an issue that we talk about here a lot in the US. So could you give us a sense of how the French public is viewing this and whether or not the war in Ukraine is being used as a political tool by different parties?
I think it is used as a political tool in a way, but it has played basically since the beginning of the war mostly in favor of Macron. You saw actually in a way for one of the first times in French political history how foreign policy played a massive role in the presidential election last year in 2022. Foreign policy in France is mostly in the hands of experts and, a small number of decision makers. And for the past year, actually, it's basically been on the headlines everywhere because war is back on the European continent, but also this war is affecting people's lives directly and their sentiment about it. And I think what has been really interesting in the way we look at public opinion and polls is that it was really obvious for actually vast majority of the French public, but also European public opinions, that their governments, their national governments, but also the European Union needed to provide massive support to Ukraine. And this has basically been constant since the beginning. We've been talking about whether there would be war fatigue at some point, whether the general opinion, the general public would turn away from its support to Ukraine because of rising energy prices and rising prices more generally. And this has not been the case. It's quite interesting that actually people do make the difference between how the war is affecting their way of life, but also more generally speaking, what it means to defend Ukraine, because it will enable us to protect our way of life more generally, because the idea now, of course, is to get Ukraine into the European Union, to create a larger European ensemble with Ukraine in it in 10 or 15 years time. But I think this is also the future that we're looking at. And I'm quite surprised not surprised, but I'm looking at this very interested in how foreign policy is actually impacting the French political scene. What we're looking at right now in France is a National Assembly that's quite divided. The government has what we call the relative majority. That's very unusual in the Fifth Republic constitutional making. And so the government has to make alliances with a number of parties, but basically on the hard left and on the hard right, there is a consensus that some of them are very openly pro-Russia And some of them are not so openly so, but they do criticize what Ukraine is doing. And they're saying that Ukraine is, behaving like a warmonger and keeps demanding basically more and more support from Europe. And we don't know where this will lead us. And so he's created a form of a stable center going from the left to the right, that is in favor of the support to Ukraine. And basically the extremes right now are very much questioning the support and asking how long we're going to push it. And so it's interesting to see how foreign policy is now basically part not only of the daily conversations of our decision makers, but also of the general public.
Yeah, those are some really interesting points. Marie, I wanted to hop back over to you to sort of build on something that you said in your opening comments, or at least alluded to. We were in Prague together a few months ago, and there were discussions about how the European geopolitical center has shifted east. What are your thoughts on that?
So I would say France is actually pretty careful on assessing that for several reasons. I would say on Ukraine, it's absolutely true that the eastern and central states in Europe have been critical in demonstrating what is at stake, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe and the future of Europe. And so in having like a lot of speeches to increase the support to Ukraine and sometimes pointing out countries that would not do enough. But at the end of the day, on the tank issue, which probably is the latest, and putting out Germany, for instance, it was the US who proved to be critical in the final decision. So the reality of what they can accomplish by themselves remain, limited in that scope, even though it is absolutely necessary. On other issues, which are not just strictly on Ukraine, but on trade, digital policy, space policy, you name it, I think. Because of the size of the economies of Germany and France, the demography, at the end of the day, I think in France, you have an acknowledgement that they haven't been reaching out enough to the Eastern and Central European states. And so there's been efforts in the past few years to actually develop strategic dialogue with the Baltic states, with Poland. You have this acknowledgement that you may have a shift power. We don't know yet how it will actually translate as a military power. They absolutely need to prove their reliability. Otherwise, there cannot be any strategic autonomy.
So that's a good point, I think, to end on. A final question for both of you. Before the war, European strategic autonomy was like the topic of the day, the topic du jour. And it was a discussion we'd have in Paris and Berlin, and it was in circles and never seemed to be able to get anywhere. And I would be curious for both of your thoughts on where you think the future of European strategic autonomy, however you might define it. And I think the sort of agreed upon definition is like the ability for Europe to act alone when necessary, but with partners most of the time, especially with the United States. So where are your thoughts on the evolution of strategic autonomy? Is it still something we should be aiming for? Is it possible? Just give us your general sense here. Tara, I'll start with you and then Marie and end with you.
Sure. So, I am a daughter of professors, so I like definitions. I've been taught to like definitions. So the definition I know of strategic autonomy is the capacity to act independently in an interdependent world. So that's a bit larger. And what we've been talking also a lot about is strategic sovereignty. And I would say sovereignty provides a much larger framework because basically, in strategic sovereignty, you have strategic autonomy, but strategic sovereignty is also about protecting trade lines, about protecting critical infrastructure, about defending the rules-based order, and about having strategic autonomy. And when you look at strategic autonomy, the general definition says that for strategic autonomy to be fulfilled, you need three components: autonomy of information, autonomy of decision, autonomy of action. On autonomy of information, the EU right now, the European Union doesn't have an intelligence network that is consolidated. So we get our information mostly on a national basis. It remains a national prerogative, but we've seen typically in the run-up to the war how that has been problematic, because the Europeans were given information by the Americans, which they were contesting. You know, they had the same basis of information, but the analysis was different. So no autonomy of information yet. Autonomy of decision, I would say that's mostly covered on the fields that are relevant to EU competency, and common defense is not totally there yet. It remains a national member states prerogative, but you know, I think we're moving in the right direction. The European Commission was tasked last year with a report to basically explain what are the capability gaps in the EU. So we're moving towards more of an autonomy of decision. Autonomy of action, as you said, we're not there yet. We need the US, and I think we need to be very clear about the fact that European strategic autonomy doesn't exclude the US. It's about the Europeans basically bolstering their capacity to act, ideally with the US, of course, and their capacity to act would be exercised in NATO framework most of the time, so that would be by definition with the US. But it is also very conscious of the fact that there are times where the US is telling us, well, this is not a security priority for us anymore. And if you look at the way, the anxious manner the Europeans followed your midterms election in the fall of 2022, that was really very obvious and almost scary, because we were thinking, well, an election in Virginia, in Connecticut, in California is going to have an impact on European security. If the Republicans get both houses, then some of them said that they were not willing to fund the aid package to Ukraine anymore. So this would have, American domestic elections would have a clear impact on European security. The reciprocal, of course, is not true.
Marie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I would say there's a paradox here, because U.S. leadership proved critical in Ukraine and continues to be. A lot conclude that European strategic autonomy is dead. Yet, never Europe has done more, actually, in defending its own interest and to be a geopolitical actor in the past year. Like, we forgot about the sanctions, about like how the EU very quickly in the war and sometimes ahead of the United States took sanctions that hurt their own interest. We forgot about the European Peace Facility. That was a revolution for the EU, about which it's an instrument that been designed to deliver lethal weapons and was actually used for Ukraine. And so I would say on strategic autonomy, the debate also evolved. No one now, I believe, sees that what the EU has done for Ukraine diminished the critical importance of NATO. The EU did stuff that NATO couldn't, and so they proved their complementarity. I'm thinking, of course, the delivery of lethal weapons, but also the training mission in Ukraine and for Ukrainian armed forces in Poland. So you have this evolution. The question is really about, could the Europeans do without the US, and is it something that is an M? And so I think for France, the idea has never been to push the US out. On the contrary, they want to have to be stronger allies for the US to keep involved in European security. But for that, like I said a bit before, you need France to be a credible and reliable partner and perceived as such by all other European partners. And I think it's very important for France to be this leader in supporting Ukraine and to be very clear on where France stands on Russia and what the future of a relationship with Russia should look like.
Well, this was an excellent and informative conversation. Tara, Marie, thank you to both of you for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today. And we look forward to having you back and continuing the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Tara.